I'm Nicole, 28 years old, and the moment I stepped into that courtroom, my parents actually laughed out loud. Not a polite chuckle or nervous giggle. A full, mocking laugh that echoed off the marble walls like I was some kind of joke they'd been waiting years to tell. My mother, Sandra, covered her mouth with her perfectly manicured hand, shoulders shaking, while my father, Richard, smirked and whispered something to their lawyer that made him glance at me with this condescending look. They thought this was going to be easy. They thought I was still that scared little girl they could push around, the one they'd spent my entire childhood telling I'd never amount to anything. But then Judge Harrison's eyes landed on me, and everything changed. His expression shifted from casual interest to something I couldn't quite read. Recognition, maybe. His hand froze mid-reach for his gavel, and he stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Wait a minute," he said slowly, his voice cutting through the courtroom chatter like a knife. "State your full name for the record." I straightened my shoulders, met his eyes directly, and spoke clearly. "Nicole Catherine Reynolds, Your Honor." The color drained from my parents' faces so fast, you'd think someone had pulled a plug. Judge Harrison set down his papers and leaned forward, studying me intently. "And your current occupation, Miss Reynolds?" My mother's lawyer started to object, clearly confused about where this was going, but the judge held up one hand to silence him. I could feel my parents' eyes burning into the side of my face. Their earlier amusement completely evaporated. This wasn't part of their script. They'd assumed I'd show up as the failure they'd always predicted, probably in some cheap outfit, maybe without proper legal representation. Instead, I stood there in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than their monthly mortgage payment, my briefcase monogrammed, every inch of me radiating the success they'd told me I'd never achieve. "I'm a senior partner at Morrison & Bradley, Your Honor," I replied calmly. "I specialize in estate law and trust litigation." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the courtroom carpet. My father's smug expression crumbled into something between shock and rage, while my mother's mouth actually fell open. Their lawyer, some guy named Dennis Potter who specialized in exploiting emotional manipulation when facts weren't on his side, looked like someone had just knocked the wind out of him. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Morrison and Bradley. That's one of the most prestigious firms in the state," Judge Harrison said, flipping through the case file in front of him. "And according to these documents, you're representing yourself in this matter, against your own parents, who are contesting your grandmother's will." The way he said it made the whole situation crystal clear to everyone in that room. This wasn't some clueless kid they could steamroll. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing, someone who'd built a career on cases exactly like this one. I watched my mother lean over to whisper frantically to Potter, probably asking how this was possible, how their screw-up daughter had ended up as a top attorney at one of the best law firms in Massachusetts. But here's what they didn't know. What they couldn't have known because they'd spent the last 10 years pretending I didn't exist. My grandmother, Eleanor Reynolds, had left me everything. Her house, her savings, her investments, her jewelry collection. Every single thing she'd spent 86 years building, she'd left to me with one very specific instruction in a sealed letter. That letter was tucked in my briefcase right now, and just thinking about her words made my throat tight. "My dearest Nicole," it started. "If you're reading this, I've finally gone to join your grandfather. But don't be sad, sweetheart. I lived a long, full life, and the best part of it was watching you grow into the remarkable woman you've become. Your parents will contest this will. I know they will because money is all they've ever cared about. But you fight them, Nicole. You show them what you're made of. Show them that all those years they spent tearing you down only made you stronger." I'd cried reading that letter, sitting alone in the lawyer's office 3 weeks after her funeral. Not sad tears, though grief was there too. These were tears of validation, of finally being seen and valued by the one person who'd never given up on me. My grandmother had watched my parents destroy my childhood with their constant criticism, their impossible standards, their complete inability to show love or support. And she'd made sure that in the end, I'd get exactly what I deserved while they got nothing. Potter cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, regardless of the defendant's credentials, the fact remains that Eleanor Reynolds was 92 years old when she changed her will, showing clear signs of dementia. And we have evidence that Miss Reynolds unduly influenced her grandmother into—" But Judge Harrison cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. The tension in that courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Counselor, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully," Judge Harrison said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Eleanor Reynolds was a dear friend of my late mother's. They volunteered together at the community center for over 30 years. I saw Mrs. Reynolds just 2 months before she passed, and her mind was as sharp as mine. He glanced down at the medical records Potter had submitted as evidence. And these documents you've provided show routine checkups with no diagnosis of dementia, no cognitive decline, nothing except normal aging. My mother made this strangled sound in her throat, somewhere between a gasp and a groan. My father's face had gone from pale to bright red, that vein in his forehead throbbing the way it always did when things didn't go his way. They'd walked into this courtroom so confident, so sure they'd win. After all, they were the grieving children, and I was just the granddaughter who'd supposedly manipulated a senile old woman. Except my grandmother hadn't been senile. Judge Harrison knew it, and now my parents were realizing they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. What they didn't understand yet, what they were about to discover, was that I hadn't just become a lawyer. I'd become the kind of lawyer who specialized in destroying cases exactly like the one they'd brought against me. See, while they'd spent the last decade ignoring my existence, I'd been building a reputation. Morrison and Bradley didn't hire just anyone. They hired winners, people who could take impossible cases and turn them into victories. And estate litigation? That was my specialty. I knew every trick, every angle, every emotional manipulation tactic that lawyers like Potter used to confuse juries and exploit grieving families. I'd seen it all, argued against it all, and won against it all. My success rate was 93%, which meant that out of every 100 cases I took, I won 93 of them. Potter was about to become another statistic, and my parents were about to learn what it felt like to be on the losing side of something they'd started. Judge Harrison continued, his voice measured and professional. So, unless you have actual evidence beyond speculation and assumptions, Mr. Potter, I'd recommend a different approach. Now, let's proceed with opening statements. Potter stood up, smoothing his tie, trying to compose himself after that setback. But I could see the panic in his eyes. He'd based his entire case on the idea that my grandmother was incompetent, and I was manipulative. One of those pillars had just crumbled, and he was scrambling to adjust. Your Honor, members of the court, Potter began, his voice taking on that syrupy tone lawyers use when they're trying to manipulate emotions instead of presenting facts. This case is about a family torn apart by greed. Sandra and Richard Reynolds lost their mother 3 months ago. Eleanor Reynolds was the matriarch of their family, a woman who raised them with love and devotion. But in her final years, she fell under the influence of her granddaughter, Nicole, who systematically isolated Eleanor from her own children. I kept my face neutral, but inside I was cataloging every lie, every distortion, every half-truth he was spinning. This was textbook emotional manipulation. Paint the clients as victims, paint me as the villain, ignore the actual facts. Potter continued, his voice rising with manufactured passion. Sandra and Richard tried to visit their mother regularly, but Nicole made excuses, turned Eleanor against them, convinced her that her own children didn't care. And then, in a moment of vulnerability, Eleanor changed her will to leave everything to Nicole. Everything. He paused for dramatic effect, letting that sink in. We're not talking about a few personal items or sentimental jewelry. We're talking about a house worth $600,000, investment accounts totaling $400,000, savings of $200,000, and various other assets. Over $1.3 million, given entirely to the granddaughter who manipulated a lonely, elderly woman in her final years. The number hung in the air like an accusation. $1.3 million. That's what this was really about for my parents. Not grief, not family, not honoring my grandmother's memory. Just money. Pure and simple greed dressed up in legal language and crocodile tears. Potter walked toward the judge's bench, his hands spread in a gesture of helplessness. All my clients want is what's fair. They're not asking for everything. They simply believe that as Eleanor's children, as the people who loved her and cared for her throughout her life, they deserve their rightful share of her estate. Before we go any further, write in the comments what you would do if you were in my position right now. And if you're feeling this story, leave a like on this video because you'll definitely want to see how this plays out. Trust me, what happens next will surprise you. Judge Harrison turned to me, his expression unreadable. Miss Reynolds, your opening statement. I stood up, picking up a single folder from my table, and walked to the center of the courtroom. No dramatics, no emotional manipulation, just facts. Your Honor, this case is indeed about family, I began, my voice calm and steady. But not in the way Mr. Potter described. This is about a woman who spent her entire life working hard, saving carefully, and making intentional decisions about her legacy. Eleanor Reynolds was not vulnerable, not confused, and certainly not manipulated. She was a retired schoolteacher who volunteered at 3 different organizations until 6 months before her death. She managed her own finances, drove her own car, and made her own decisions with complete clarity. I opened the folder, pulling out the first document. This is a letter from Dr. Patricia Morgan, my grandmother's physician for 22 years. It states that Eleanor Reynolds underwent a complete cognitive assessment 4 months before updating her will. The results showed normal cognitive function for her age. I walked toward Potter's table, handing him a copy, then gave one to the judge. This isn't speculation or assumption. This is medical documentation proving that my grandmother was completely competent when she made her decisions. My mother was gripping the armrest of her chair so hard her knuckles had turned white. She wasn't looking at me. She couldn't. Because she knew what was coming, knew that every word I was saying was backed by documentation she couldn't refute. As for the allegation that I isolated my grandmother from her children, I continued, turning to face my parents directly for the first time. I have phone records, text messages, and calendar entries spanning the last 5 years of my grandmother's life. They tell a very different story than the one Mr. Potter is selling. I pulled out another document, this one significantly thicker. These records show that my grandmother called my mother 68 times in those 5 years. My mother answered 11 times. 11. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear people breathing. My grandmother invited my parents to Sunday dinner every single week for 5 years. That's 260 invitations. They attended 4 times, 4 dinners in 5 years. I let that sink in, watching Potter's face as he realized his entire narrative was about to collapse. The truth, Your Honor, is simple. Eleanor Reynolds left her estate to the person who actually showed up for her. The person who called every day, visited twice a week, took her to doctor appointments, and sat with her during her final days. That person was me, I said quietly. Not because I wanted her money, because I loved her, and she loved me in a way my parents never could. I walked back to my table, pulled out a photograph, and held it up for the judge to see. It was from my law school graduation 5 years ago. My grandmother stood next to me, beaming with pride, holding the bouquet of roses she'd brought. This is who showed up when I graduated at the top of my class from law school. My grandmother drove 3 hours by herself because my parents couldn't be bothered. I set down that photo and picked up another one. This is from my 25th birthday. My grandmother organized a surprise party because she knew I'd been working 100-hour weeks preparing for the bar exam and needed to celebrate. Another photo. This is from the night I made partner at Morrison and Bradley, the youngest person in the firm's history to achieve that position. My grandmother was there, front row, cheering louder than anyone. Each photograph was another nail in my parents' coffin. You know what all these photos have in common? I asked, looking directly at Judge Harrison. My parents aren't in a single one. Not because they weren't invited. They were invited to everything. They just never came. Potter was shuffling through papers frantically, probably looking for something, anything, to counter what I was presenting. But there was nothing. You can't argue with photographic evidence. You can't spin a story when the truth is staring everyone in the face. My grandmother didn't leave me her estate because I manipulated her, I said, my voice firm and clear. She left it to me because I earned it through 10 years of showing up, of being present, of loving her unconditionally. That's not manipulation. That's family. I turned to look at my parents one more time, and for just a second, I saw something flicker across my mother's face. Shame, maybe? Or just anger that her plan wasn't working. Hard to tell with Sandra. She'd always been good at hiding her real feelings. Before we continue, let me know in the comments. Between parents who only show up when money is involved and a grandson who is there for everything, who deserves the inheritance? Leave your opinion in the comments because this story is about to get even more intense. You won't believe what my parents tried to claim next. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying both sides carefully. Mr. Potter, call your first witness. Potter stood up, straightening his jacket. The plaintiff calls Sandra Reynolds to the stand. My mother walked to the witness stand like she was walking a runway, every movement calculated for maximum sympathy. She wore a simple black dress, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back in a modest bun. The grieving daughter costume, perfectly executed. After she was sworn in, Potter approached with that same gentle, sympathetic expression he'd used during his opening statement. Mrs. Reynolds, can you describe your relationship with your mother? Sandra's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. My mother was my best friend. She raised me and my brother after our father died when I was 12. She worked 2 jobs to keep us fed and clothed. She sacrificed everything for us. So far, all true. My grandmother had been widowed young and worked incredibly hard. And when you had Nicole, how did your mother react? Potter continued. Oh, she was thrilled, Sandra said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that seemed to appear from nowhere. She couldn't wait to be a grandmother. She offered to help however she could because Richard and I were both working full-time. Here we go, I thought. The spin begins. But over time, things changed, Sandra continued, her voice getting softer, more wounded. My mother became very controlling. She questioned every parenting decision I made. She'd call multiple times a day, insisting I was doing things wrong. Eventually, it became easier to just let Nicole spend more time with her than to deal with the constant criticism. I kept my face neutral, but I was making mental notes for cross-examination. Every word she was saying was either a complete lie or a twisted version of the truth. Potter nodded sympathetically. That must have been difficult. Did you try to maintain a relationship with your mother despite these challenges? Sandra sniffled. I tried constantly. I'd call and she wouldn't answer. I'd invite her to events, and she'd make excuses about needing to stay home with Nicole. It was like she'd replaced me with my own daughter. The audacity of this woman was truly breathtaking. She was actually sitting there, under oath, claiming that my grandmother had pushed her away when the evidence I had sitting in my briefcase proved the exact opposite. Potter walked her through a series of questions designed to paint her as the victim of a controlling mother and a manipulative daughter. Mrs. Reynolds, in your mother's final years, did you try to visit her? Potter asked, his tone dripping with sympathy. Every chance I got, Sandra replied, her voice breaking. But Nicole always had an excuse. Grandma's sleeping, Grandma's not feeling well, Grandma doesn't want visitors. I felt like I was being blocked from seeing my own mother. She was good. I had to give her that. If I didn't have documentation proving every word was a lie, I might have almost believed her myself. And when you learned about the will, how did that make you feel? Potter continued. Sandra looked directly at the judge, tears streaming down her face now. Devastated. Not because of the money, Your Honor. Because it felt like my mother's final statement was that I didn't matter, that I wasn't good enough, that Nicole was the daughter she wished she'd had instead of me. The performance was Oscar-worthy. The tears, the trembling voice, the wounded daughter routine. If this were a movie, she'd be a shoo-in for Best Actress. Potter returned to his table. No further questions. Judge Harrison looked at me. Cross-examination, Miss Reynolds? I stood up, grabbed my folder of evidence, and approached the witness stand. My mother wouldn't look at me, keeping her eyes focused somewhere over my left shoulder. Classic avoidance technique. Mrs. Reynolds, you testified that you tried to visit your mother constantly, but I prevented you. Is that correct? I asked, my voice professional and detached. Yes, Sandra said quietly. That's correct. I pulled out a document from my folder. This is my grandmother's phone log from the last 2 years of her life. I'm going to ask you about some specific dates. I flipped to a marked page. On March 15th, 2 years ago, my grandmother called you at 9 in the morning. The call lasted 6 minutes. Do you remember that conversation? Sandra shifted uncomfortably. I don't remember every specific call. She started, but I cut her off politely. Let me refresh your memory, I said calmly. During that call, my grandmother invited you to Sunday dinner. You said you were too busy. She then asked if you could come the following Sunday. You said probably not. She asked when you might be available. You said you'd check your schedule and call back. I looked up from the document. Did you call back? Sandra's face had gone pale. I don't recall, she stammered. You didn't, I interrupted. In fact, you didn't call her again for 6 weeks. I pulled out another document. April 27th, my grandmother called again. This call lasted 3 minutes. She asked if you could come for her birthday the following week. You said you'd try. Did you attend her birthday? The silence was deafening. Mrs. Reynolds, did you attend your mother's 87th birthday party? I repeated. I had a work conflict, Sandra said weakly. A work conflict, I echoed. Interesting. Because according to your Facebook post from that day, you were at a spa in Newport with friends. I walked to Potter's table and handed him a printed screenshot. That's you, isn't it? Posted at 2 in the afternoon on your mother's birthday with the caption, Much Needed Girls' Day? My mother's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. This was information he clearly didn't have. Information that made his client look exactly like what she was. A liar. Over the course of 2 years, Mrs. Reynolds, your mother called you 93 times, I continued, pulling out the complete phone records. You answered 17 of those calls. The average duration of those calls was 4.2 minutes. Most of them ended with you saying you had to go or you'd call back later. The records show you initiated contact with your mother exactly twice in those 2 years. Sandra was crying again, but these weren't the calculated tears from earlier. These were tears of humiliation, of being exposed. You testified that I prevented you from visiting, I said, my voice still calm and professional. But the truth is, you were never trying to visit in the first place. I returned to my table and picked up another folder. These are text messages between you and my grandmother from the last 3 years of her life. Would you like me to read some of them aloud? Sandra finally looked at me, and the hatred in her eyes was almost palpable. That won't be necessary, Judge Harrison said quietly, reaching for the folder. I'll review them myself. I handed them over and turned back to my mother. Let's talk about the financial aspects of your relationship with your mother, I said, shifting gears. You testified earlier that this case isn't about money, is that correct? Sandra nodded, trying to regain her composure. Yes, it's about honoring my mother's true wishes. I pulled out a stack of bank statements. These are records from my grandmother's checking account going back 15 years. According to these records, she gave you money on a regular basis. Can you tell the court approximately how much you received over those 15 years? My mother's face went from pale to bright red. I don't know the exact amount, she started. $268,000, I said, cutting her off. Over 15 years, your mother gave you $268,000. That averages out to about $17,867 per year. I let that number hang in the air for a moment. Can you explain what that money was used for? Sandra's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Various things. Bills, expenses, helping Richard with his business ventures. She stammered. His business ventures, I repeated. You mean the restaurant that went bankrupt after 18 months? Or the online consulting company that never had a single client? Or perhaps the real estate investment scheme that lost $60,000? Each failed venture was another punch to their credibility. Your mother supported you financially for your entire adult life while you barely maintained contact with her. Is that a fair summary? Potter objected. Your Honor, this is badgering the witness. Judge Harrison shook his head. Overruled. Answer the question, Mrs. Reynolds. Sandra's voice was barely a whisper. She wanted to help us. I pulled out one more document, this one particularly damning. This is an email you sent to my grandmother 4 years ago. May I read it aloud? I didn't wait for permission. Dear Mom, Richard's business needs another $20,000 to stay afloat. I know you've already helped, but we're desperate. If you can't loan us the money, we understand, but don't expect us to keep making the trip out there for visits when we're this stressed about finances. We need family who supports us, not judges us. The courtroom went completely silent. Even Potter looked shocked. So you're saying your visits were conditional on financial support? I asked quietly. You'd only come see your mother if she kept giving you money? My mother was crying openly now, mascara running down her face, but there was no sympathy in the room. That's not what I meant. Sandra sobbed, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Then what did you mean, Mrs. Reynolds? Because that email seems pretty clear. Visit us or give us money, but we won't do both unless you pay us. I walked back to my table, letting her sit there in her humiliation. One final question. When was the last time you told your mother you loved her? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sandra's face crumpled. I don't remember exactly, she whispered. You don't remember, I repeated softly. I do. It was at Grandma's funeral when you leaned over her casket and said, I love you, Mom, in front of everyone. The last time before that was 11 years ago, on a birthday card you signed but didn't mail until 3 weeks after her birthday. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom like a blanket. No further questions, I said, returning to my seat. Judge Harrison looked at Sandra with barely concealed disgust. You may step down, Mrs. Reynolds. My mother practically fled the witness stand, her earlier composure completely shattered. She'd walked up there playing the victim and walked down exposed as exactly what she was. A user, a manipulator, someone who valued money over relationships. Potter stood up, clearly rattled. The plaintiff calls Richard Reynolds to the stand. My father took the oath and sat down, his posture defensive, arms crossed. He knew what was coming. He'd just watched me demolish my mother's testimony, and now it was his turn. Potter tried to rehabilitate the situation. Mr. Reynolds, can you describe your relationship with Eleanor? Richard cleared his throat. She was a good woman, hardworking, dedicated to her family. I always respected her, even when we didn't see eye to eye. Diplomatic answer, carefully neutral. And your relationship with your daughter, Nicole? Potter continued. Richard glanced at me, then away quickly. It's been strained. Nicole always preferred her grandmother to us, made it difficult to have a normal father-daughter relationship. I almost laughed at the audacity, blaming me for the relationship he'd never bothered to build. Potter walked him through similar questions as my mother, trying to paint the same picture of devoted parents pushed away by controlling grandmother and manipulative granddaughter. But the energy in the room had shifted. No one was buying it anymore. When it was my turn for cross-examination, I stood up with a different folder. This one was thinner, but potentially more damaging. Mr. Reynolds, you testified that you always respected my grandmother. Is that correct? I asked. Yes, Richard said stiffly. Then can you explain this? I pulled out a printed email and handed copies to both the judge and Potter. This is an email you sent to your business partner 6 years ago. I'm going to read a specific portion. Sandra's mother is sitting on a fortune and living like a miser. When the old lady finally kicks it, we'll be set for life. The color drained from Richard's face. I was joking, he started, but I cut him off. Were you joking when you sent this email to a real estate agent 3 months after my grandmother's death? I pulled out another document. This one inquires about luxury condos in Florida, specifically mentioning that you're expecting a significant inheritance soon and want to know what's available in the $200,000 range. Richard's hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair. That was just preliminary research, he stammered. Preliminary research based on money you assumed you'd inherit, I said. Money from the grandmother you claim to have respected and loved, whose death you were apparently planning for. I walked closer to the witness stand, my voice still calm, but my words cutting. You never visited my grandmother in her final 6 months? Not once. Can you explain why? Richard shifted uncomfortably. I was dealing with business issues, stress. Things were complicated, he tried to explain. You were dealing with business issues, I repeated. The same business issues you'd been dealing with for 20 years? The same businesses that kept failing while my grandmother kept bailing you out? I pulled out more bank records. According to these statements, my grandmother loaned you money for 7 different business ventures over 14 years. Total amount, $193,000. How much of that did you pay back? Silence. Mr. Reynolds, how much did you repay? I pressed. I was planning to pay it back once the businesses became profitable, Richard said weakly. But they never became profitable, did they? I said. Every single one failed. And yet you kept asking for more money, kept making promises you never kept, kept taking from a woman who worked her entire life to save that money. I returned to my table and picked up one final document. This is a letter my grandmother wrote to you 12 years ago. I found it in her papers after she died. She never sent it, but I think it's relevant. I began reading aloud. Dear Richard, I'm writing this letter because I need to say things I can't say to your face without Sandra getting defensive. I love my daughter, but I'm disappointed in the man she married. Every time you ask for money, you promise it's the last time. Every time a business fails, you blame external factors instead of taking responsibility. I give you money because I love Sandra and don't want to see her struggle, but I want you to know that I see exactly what you're doing. My voice remained steady as I continued reading. You view me as a bank account, not as family. You visit only when you need something. You make promises about paying me back that we both know you'll never keep. I'm tired, Richard. I'm tired of funding your dreams while you ignore the family right in front of you. Nicole asks about you sometimes, wonders why her father doesn't come around. I don't know what to tell her anymore. The courtroom was absolutely silent. I'm setting aside money for Nicole's education because I know you won't. I'm making sure she has opportunities you'll never provide. Not because you can't, but because you won't. You're too focused on the next big thing, the next scheme, the next shortcut to wealth. Meanwhile, you're missing your daughter's entire childhood. I looked up from the letter, meeting Richard's eyes. My grandmother never sent this letter because she didn't want to hurt my mother, but she kept it, along with detailed records of every dollar she gave you, every promise you broke, every visit you canceled. She documented everything because she knew someday it would matter. Richard's face had gone from red to ashen. He looked like he wanted to disappear. You sat here and testified about respect and family, but the truth is you viewed my grandmother as an ATM machine, I said quietly. And now that she's gone, you're trying to take the money she specifically left to someone who actually loved her. I walked back to my table. No further questions. Judge Harrison looked at Richard with open contempt. Step down, Mr. Reynolds. Potter called 2 more witnesses, both friends of my parents who testified to their good character. But the damage was done. Their testimony felt hollow after what had been revealed. When it was my turn to present my case, I called Dr. Patricia Morgan first. She testified about my grandmother's cognitive abilities, her independence, her clear decision-making right up until the end. Then I called my grandmother's estate attorney, Margaret Walsh, who'd known her for 30 years. Miss Walsh, can you describe the process of creating Eleanor Reynolds's final will? I asked. Margaret sat up straight, her voice clear and professional. Eleanor contacted me 2 years before her death. She wanted to update her will completely. We met 4 separate times over 6 months. She was very specific about her wishes. Margaret pulled out her notes. She told me she wanted to leave everything to Nicole. When I asked if she was certain, she said she'd never been more certain of anything in her life. Did she seem confused or coerced in any way? I asked. Absolutely not, Margaret said firmly. Eleanor was one of the sharpest clients I've ever worked with. She brought documentation to support her decisions. She anticipated that Sandra and Richard might contest the will, and she wanted to make sure everything was airtight. I walked to my table and picked up a sealed envelope. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a letter my grandmother left with her attorney, to be read only if her will was contested. Judge Harrison nodded. Proceed. I opened the envelope carefully, pulling out my grandmother's familiar handwriting. This letter is dated 2 years ago, the same day she finalized her will. May I read it aloud? The judge nodded again. I took a breath and began. To whoever is reading this, most likely a judge considering whether my final wishes should be honored. My name is Eleanor Jane Reynolds. I am 90 years old, of sound mind and body, and I am making this statement of my own free will. I am leaving my entire estate to my granddaughter, Nicole Catherine Reynolds, for the following reasons. My voice caught slightly, but I pushed through. Nicole has been the light of my life since the day she was born. While my daughter Sandra and her husband Richard pursued their own interests, Nicole has been my constant companion, my joy, my purpose. I continued reading, my grandmother's words painting a picture of our relationship that needed no embellishment. Nicole calls me every single day, not because she has to, but because she wants to. She visits twice a week, takes me to appointments, helps with groceries, and most importantly, she talks to me like I matter. Sandra calls when she needs money. Richard calls when Sandra makes him. They visit perhaps 4 times a year, usually around holidays, and they leave as quickly as possible. The courtroom was completely still, everyone hanging on every word. I have given Sandra and Richard over $400,000 during my lifetime. I continued reading. I don't regret it because I love my daughter, but I will not reward their neglect with my final assets. They had every opportunity to build a relationship with me. They chose not to. My grandmother's words cut through every excuse, every justification my parents had tried to offer. Nicole earned this inheritance through years of love, devotion, and presence. If someone is contesting this will, it's because they want money they didn't earn from a relationship they didn't maintain. Nicole, if you're reading this, know that every penny I'm leaving you is given with love and pride. You've become an extraordinary woman despite your parents, not because of them. Use this money wisely, live fully, and never doubt that you were loved beyond measure. I had to pause, fighting back tears. Signed, Eleanor Jane Reynolds. The silence that followed was profound. Judge Harrison took the letter from me, reading it himself carefully. When he finished, he looked at my parents with undisguised disgust. Does the defense have any other witnesses? He asked. Just one, Your Honor, I said. I'd like to call myself to the stand. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. I was sworn in and took the seat, looking directly at Potter, who stood to cross-examine me. Miss Reynolds, isn't it true that you stood to gain significantly from isolating your grandmother from her children? Potter began, trying one last desperate angle. I didn't isolate her from anyone, I replied calmly. I simply showed up. There's a difference. Potter tried to rattle me with questions about my finances, suggesting I needed the inheritance, but I shut that down quickly. I made $240,000 last year as a senior partner at Morrison & Bradley. I own my own home, drive a car I paid cash for, and have over $300,000 in my personal savings and investments. I didn't need my grandmother's money. I wanted her company. Potter switched tactics. But you must admit it's convenient that she left everything to you right around the time you became successful. I smiled slightly. My grandmother changed her will 2 years ago. I'd already been a lawyer for 3 years at that point. Already made partner, already established my career. She didn't leave me money hoping I'd succeed. She left it to me because I already had, and she wanted to contribute to the life I'd built. Potter tried several more approaches, but each one fell flat. Finally, Potter gave up and sat down. Judge Harrison looked at me. Miss Reynolds, I have a question. In your professional opinion, having handled numerous estate cases, is there anything about this case that strikes you as unusual? I thought carefully before answering. What's unusual, Your Honor, is not the will itself. It's perfectly reasonable for someone to leave their estate to the person who cared for them. What's unusual is the shamelessness of the contest. Most people, when confronted with evidence of their own neglect, would accept responsibility. My parents have sat here for 2 days listening to documentation of their failures, their broken promises, their prioritization of money over relationships, and they still believe they deserve half of what my grandmother built. I looked directly at Sandra and Richard. That's not unusual. That's just sad. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Step down, Miss Reynolds. I returned to my table, and Potter gave his closing argument. It was weak, full of emotional appeals that rang hollow after everything that had been presented. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Eleanor Reynolds was competent, intentional, and generous. She gave my parents every opportunity to be part of her life, and they chose not to take it. She documented everything because she knew this day would come. She left me her estate not because I manipulated her, but because I loved her and she loved me back. That's not undue influence. That's family. I picked up the stack of evidence we'd presented. The phone records, the bank statements, the emails, the letters, they all tell the same story. My parents valued my grandmother's money more than her company, and now they want to be rewarded for that behavior. I'm asking the court to honor Eleanor Reynolds' clearly stated wishes. Let her final act be one of love for the person who loved her back, not a windfall for people who saw her as a financial resource. I sat down, and Judge Harrison began reviewing his notes. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, he looked up, his expression grave. I've presided over many estate cases in my career, he began. Most of them involved genuine disagreements about unclear intentions or ambiguous language. This is not one of those cases. Eleanor Reynolds made her intentions crystal clear through documentation, testimony, and her own written words. The evidence presented by the plaintiffs suggests a pattern of financial dependence and emotional neglect spanning decades. The evidence presented by the defendant demonstrates consistent care, presence, and genuine relationship. Judge Harrison looked directly at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, your testimony was contradicted by phone records, emails, and your own written communications. The court finds no evidence of undue influence, no evidence of diminished capacity, and no reason to overturn Eleanor Reynolds' clearly stated wishes. He picked up his gavel. The will is upheld in its entirety. Nicole Reynolds is the sole beneficiary of Eleanor Reynolds' estate. Furthermore, given the frivolous nature of this contest and the clear evidence that the plaintiffs were aware their claims lacked merit, I'm ordering Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds to pay Miss Reynolds legal fees and court costs. The crack of the gavel felt like thunder. My mother let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. My father sat frozen, his face a mask of shock and rage. Potter started to object, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a look. This court is adjourned. Judge Harrison stood and left the bench, and just like that, it was over. I'd won. Not that there was ever any real doubt, but hearing it officially, having my grandmother's wishes validated and protected, felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. My parents stood up, Sandra still crying, Richard's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. They headed toward the exit without looking at me, but I wasn't going to let them leave without saying what needed to be said. Sandra? Richard? I called out, my voice carrying across the nearly empty courtroom. They stopped but didn't turn around. I just want you to know something, I continued, walking toward them slowly. Grandma left me a box of letters along with everything else. Letters she wrote to you over the years but never sent because she didn't want to hurt you. Letters where she talked about missing you, wondering if she'd failed as a mother, hoping you'd come visit. Now they turned, and I could see confusion on their faces mixed with the anger. She loved you until the very end, I said quietly. Despite everything, despite the disappointment, despite knowing exactly what you were, she still loved you because that's who she was. She was incapable of turning off her love even when it wasn't returned. Sandra's face crumpled, fresh tears streaming down. But here's the thing, I continued, my voice harder now. She also saw you clearly. She knew you'd contest the will. She knew you'd try to paint me as the villain and yourselves as victims. She prepared for all of it because she understood who you really are. She gave you over $400,000 during her lifetime. Money you never paid back, never even thanked her for properly. She supported you through every failed business, every broken promise, every disappointment, and you repaid her with neglect. I stepped closer, making sure they heard every word. You had 32 years to be my parents. You chose not to. You had decades to be good children to your mother. You chose not to. And now you're angry because she left her money to someone who actually showed up. Richard found his voice finally. You turned her against us, he said, but there was no conviction in it. Just a last, desperate attempt to justify his failures. I didn't have to, I replied simply. You did that all by yourselves. Every missed visit, every ignored phone call, every promise to come by that you broke. I didn't poison her against you. You poisoned yourselves. Sandra was sobbing openly now, and for just a moment I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. But then I remembered every birthday they missed, every school event where I looked for them and they weren't there, every time my grandmother made excuses for them while her own heart broke. The pity died. You could have been part of something beautiful, I said softly. You could have had a relationship with an extraordinary woman who would have loved you unconditionally if you'd given her even the smallest reason to. Instead, you chose money over love, convenience over commitment, and now you have neither. I turned to walk away, then paused and looked back one more time. The money Grandma left me? I'm using part of it to establish a scholarship fund in her name for first-generation college students, because that's what she would have wanted. The rest I'm investing for my future children, so they'll have the opportunities she made sure I had. I let that sink in. Your grandchildren, by the way. Kids you'll never meet because I learned from the best what real family looks like and you're not it. With that, I walked out of the courtroom, leaving them standing there with nothing but their own choices and their own regrets. Outside, the autumn sun was bright and warm. I stood on the courthouse steps, took a deep breath, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. My phone buzzed. A text from my mentor at Morrison and Bradley. Heard you won. Never doubted you for a second. Drinks tonight? I smiled and texted back. Absolutely. As I walked to my car, I thought about my grandmother, about her final gift to me. It wasn't really the money, though that was substantial. It wasn't even the house or the investments or the jewelry. Her real gift was the validation, the proof, documented and legally recognized, that I had mattered, that our relationship had been real and valuable and worth protecting. She'd seen me, truly seen me, in a way my parents never had and never would, and she'd made sure that even after she was gone, that truth would be acknowledged. I got in my car, pulled out the letter she'd left for me, the one I'd read 100 times already, and read it once more. You are enough, Nicole. You have always been enough, not because of what you achieved or what you became, but because of who you are. Never forget that. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in my bag, and drove away from that courthouse knowing that I'd honored her memory in the best way possible. By standing up for truth, by refusing to let her final wishes be twisted by people who'd never understood her worth. 3 months later, I was at the community center where my grandmother had volunteered for 30 years, announcing the Eleanor Jane Reynolds Scholarship Fund. 50 people showed up, people whose lives she'd touched through her quiet, consistent kindness. Not one of them was surprised that she'd left her estate to me. They all knew who'd been there, who'd cared, who'd loved her. As I spoke about her legacy, I realized something profound. My parents had taught me what not to be. They'd shown me through their absence and their selfishness exactly the kind of person I never wanted to become. But my grandmother had taught me what to aspire to. Kindness without expecting return, love without conditions, strength wrapped in gentleness. And in the end, that was the real inheritance. Not the money or the house or the investments, but the example of a life lived with integrity and grace. So that's my story. The day my parents laughed at me in court and discovered I wasn't the failure they'd always assumed I'd be. The day their greed was exposed and my grandmother's wisdom was vindicated. I'm curious about your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated you? Have you experienced that moment when people who dismissed you suddenly realized they were wrong? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing about moments when truth wins over manipulation. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt undervalued by the people who should have valued you most, do me a favor and share this video. Someone in your life needs to hear that it's okay to set boundaries with toxic family members, even parents. That choosing yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is letting people who hurt you continue to hurt you. Hit that subscribe button too, because I share stories like this regularly. Real situations, real emotions, real victories over people who thought they could win by being cruel or manipulative. Thanks for watching, for listening, and for being part of this community. Remember, you don't owe loyalty to people who've never been loyal to you. Family is about love and respect, not just shared DNA. And sometimes the family you choose, the people who show up for you, matter more than the family you were born into. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next one.